All right, you guys, picking up where we left off, starting to talk about some of the actual organs involved in the endocrine system. We talked about all of the, not all of, but a bit of the basic physiology, the physiological mechanisms by which the endocrine system physically works. So let's talk about some of the players here in this drama, if you will. So your primary endocrine glands, starting superiorly, are your pineal gland, which actually hangs down into the third ventricle of the brain. Your hypothalamus, which we talked about a lot, right? That is going to be in the diencephalon. It's actually right down here, just below the thalamus, hence hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is directly connected to the pituitary gland, which is your little dangly guys right about here. The pituitary is divided into an anterior and a posterior portion, which we will discuss. Moving down, we have our thyroid gland, which sits here in front of the trachea, this butterfly-shaped gland here. The parathyroid glands, which are 4 little glands that are on the that posterior surface of the thyroid gland. Your thymus is another gland associated with the trachea or the bronchi. We're not going to talk too much in depth about this guy because it atrophies and kind of disappears into adulthood. So you have a very large thymus as a newborn and infant, but it kind of shrinks as life goes on. Moving down to our kidneys. On top of our kidneys, we have our little adrenal glands, one on each kidney. The pancreas sits below our stomach. And finally, our reproductive organs, including ovaries and or testes, are also part of the endocrine system. So you'll notice that a lot of these organs are multi-system organs, right? The pituitary and pineal and hypothalamus, these guys are all also like considered to be part of the brain, right? Considered to be part of the diencephalon of the brain, so that's nervous system. Your pancreas is considered part of your digestive system. And of course, ovaries and testes are most commonly thought of as being part of the reproductive system. So your endocrine system shares organs with other systems, okay? Other things that also produce hormones and kind of interact with the endocrine system without having specific designated or dedicated glands include your heart, believe it or not, your fat, so some adipose tissue throughout your body, your digestive tract itself, okay, so your small and large intestines, your kidneys, not just the adrenal glands sitting on top of them, but your actual kidneys. They also have functions and produce hormones that interact with your endocrine system. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the hypothalamus. So again, this is hypo as in below the thalamus, which is this structure right here, central to the diencephalon, really central to your brain in general, right? The hypothalamus is this little portion right down here. We've got, we already talked about some of the functions of the hypothalamus on a general sense and in more of a nervous system sense. But in an endocrine sense, let's talk about how the hypothalamus actually works, right? So it's involved in some very important autonomic, involuntary processes, homeostasis maintenance kinds of things like your heart rate, the water balance in your body, right? So your hydration, your body temperature, and it is linked pretty directly here to your pituitary gland, which is shown right here, right? And here again, we can see the anterior portion, which is also known as the adenohypophysis, the adenohypophysis, and the neurohypophysis is the posterior portion. The adenohypophysis is more involved in secreting hormones for endocrine functions, and the neurohypophysis, hence the name neuro, right, sends ADH and oxytocin, which is actually produced as at the ends of neurons here. So neurohypophysis, they're neurotransmitters because they're being released by neurons, but they are hormones because once they leave the neurons, they leave the pituitary gland, which is an endocrine gland. Okay, so in this case, your ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin, they are hormones because they are being released from an endocrine gland, your pituitary gland, but they're being released from axons of neurons, which is nervous system. So kind of weird, as opposed to a proper or a regular endocrine gland as we normally think of them, which is like little epithelial tissue producing hormones and secreting them into the bloodstream. So your neurons in your hypothalamus produce hormones that it pretty much usually passes or often passes right to the pituitary. The pituitary receives hormones from the hypothalamus and basically continues that signal on by releasing the same or a different hormone. These are all regulatory hormones. Your hypothalamus, again, we talked about this when we talked about the autonomic nervous system. Your hypothalamus is kind of the end-all, be-all regulator for your autonomic nervous system, so also a lot of your endocrine system. The buck kind of starts here, if you will. The hypothalamus receives information from the brain. It's going to receive that sensory information from the sensory side of your autonomic nervous system, which is homeostasis kind of stuff, right? Your hypothalamus is going to basically receive the chosen response, the plan, right, from the motor cortex of the brain, autonomic again, right? So once it receives the plan, it is going to produce the first hormone that sets off the chain of reaction. So it's going to produce the first hormone that it sends to the pituitary, or that it might send directly to another gland, but often sends it to the pituitary, and then the pituitary sends something as a result of that signal, okay? All right, we're going to talk more in depth about these guys. Okay, so your hypothalamus, again, this is going to reiterate what I just said, I think. Your hypothalamus is going to regulate both your endocrine and your nervous system. So it's going to produce regulatory hormones that control the anterior pituitary, which basically produces more hormones that are then sent into the bloodstream to the rest of the body, the rest of the endocrine system specifically, usually. It also can have direct neural control over other glands, right? So it is both endocrine and neural. You can also get neural signals passing from the hypothalamus along motor pathways, autonomic motor pathways to a gland directly. And it can also release antidiuretic hormone or oxytocin through the posterior pituitary, which the only difference between the anterior and the posterior is that the hormones produced by the posterior, which are ADH and oxytocin, are secreted out of the ends of neurons, as opposed to the anterior pituitary, which is like a proper endocrine gland, produces the hormone precursor, builds the hormone, and then secretes it into the bloodstream. The anterior pituitary is also known as the adenohypophysis, and the posterior pituitary is also known as the neurohypophysis. All right, the posterior pituitary in a little bit more detail. The hypothalamus is involved, it has neurons. As part of the brain, it has neurons. Those neurons are going to be a direct link to the posterior pituitary or the neurohypophysis. Those neurons will terminate in axon terminals, as they do, and the molecules, which we consider to be hormones because they are going to be leaving a endocrine gland, the pituitary gland, those molecules are going to be released by the axon terminals and taken up by nearby capillaries, okay? So that is how the posterior pituitary releases its products into the bloodstream. And again, those products are going to be your antidiuretic hormone and your oxytocin. Antidiuretic hormone, we already talked a little bit about oxytocin, oxytocin being like the bonding hormone we often think about. Antidiuretic hormone is a hormone involved or important for your kidneys. A diuretic is something that tends to dehydrate you, right? So an antidiuretic hormone is going to be something that allows you to retain water in your body, okay? Your antidiuretic hormone is also controlled or inhibited, I should say, by alcohol intake. So when you drink, you may find that you need to pee a lot, and that's because your antidiuretic hormone has been inhibited, which means that your body isn't going to retain the water. Instead, it's going to release the water, right? So it releases the water into your bladder, meaning that you have to break the seal, right? And then you have to pee all the time. That's why that happens. The anterior pituitary is also controlled by the hypothalamus, which again is neural, but the neural connection ends here before we really get to the anterior pituitary, the adenohypophysis. The signal between the hypothalamus and the adenohypophysis is one that stimulates the gland itself to produce hormones. So instead of having neurons that produce the hormones, the neurons will instead stimulate the rest of the gland to produce hormones, okay? So you don't need to know too much about the details of this per se. We're basically activating capillary beds to take up the produced hormone from the anterior pituitary. It is the anterior pituitary, or the adenohypophysis, is often known as the master gland because it produces so many hormones that go on to do like a huge number of things throughout your body. So these hormones, growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and prolactin. These are all hormones produced by the anterior pituitary and that go on to create like far-reaching cascades throughout the body, critically important stuff. So the anterior pituitary is also known as the master gland for this reason. Okay. Moving down the body now to the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland sits on the anterior surface of your trachea, right? Your breathing tube in blue here. What else about it? You've got a lot of vasculature associated with the thyroid gland. So thyroid surgery tends to be very, very bloody, but it's very vascularized for a good reason, right? This gland produces hormones that get passed into the bloodstream. So we have to have a nice solid connection there, strong connection there. Looking at a microscope slide of the pituitary gland or of tissue from the pituitary gland, you will be able to see the follicles of the gland. So again, recalling that endocrine glands do not have ducts, right? These are not tubes that we are looking at here in cross section, okay? These are more like little, little hollow balls or little hollow spheres, little bubbles whose walls are made up of that simple cuboidal epithelial tissue that we talked about in part A, right? So in a good example, you might be able to recognize that this is simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. And that simple cuboidal epithelial tissue makes a little bubble around a droplet of colloid. And colloid, we also learned in part A, is a general term for mixture, a type of mixture in which the solute is suspended in the solvent, but it's not homogenized in the solvent. It's still kind of its own thing, just kind of floating in the solvent instead of dissolving. So a colloid in this sense is specifically a colloid that contains the solutes needed to produce the hormone that your thyroid gland produces, which is going to be your thyroid hormone, right? So this colloid is basically a hormone precursor. So this is a mixture of solutes and solvent. It contains all of the building blocks needed to create a hormone. The epithelial cells surrounding the colloid are going to use those building blocks to produce the hormone and deposit it into a nearby blood vessel, okay? These parafollicular cells, these cells, the subcuboidal epithelial cells that surround the colloid are going to be your follicular cells, as in cells of the follicle, okay? As in, and one of these is considered to be a follicle, okay? So the pituitary, so the thyroid gland is it's a squishy, think of it like a squishy, spongy, solid gland made up of all these little bubbles of epithelial cells, simple cuboidal epithelial cells, and each little bubble contains the colloid, which is the precursor for the hormone. The epithelial cells making the bubble are also known as follicular cells because they are the cells of that follicle, right? So each little bubble is a follicle making up this gland. And each follicle uses these precursors to build the hormone and then pass it on to a blood vessel and pass that hormone into the blood vessel. You also have parafollicular cells, which basically just means follicular cells that are kind of doing their own thing outside of a proper follicle. They secrete a slightly different hormone called calcitonin, which we don't really understand very well, but we know that it has inhibitory effects for your osteoclasts, so it helps you to retain bone tissue. Beyond that, we're not really sure. While the follicular cells are producing thyroid hormone. Okay. Here is another microscope image of the thyroid gland. Here is a thyroid follicle, again, surrounded by follicular cells. That's an O. Right? These follicular cells are also known as T thyrocytes, but you don't really need to know them as that. I'm really more interested in you knowing them as follicular cells. We already talked about the colloid inside of the follicle. Capillaries surrounding the follicle are going to be where that hormone, once it's built, is going to be deposited. The C thyrocyte cells are the ones that are producing calcitonin. The T thyrocytes are producing thyroid hormone. Okay, that's why they're called T thyrocytes and C thyrocytes. Thyrocyte. Remember, anything that ends in the word cyte, C-Y-T-E, the letters cyte, is a cell. Okay, so these are cells of the thyroid gland, thyrocytes. Say it 5 times fast. Thyroglobulin, don't worry about that so much. That's, again, one of those precursors that is floating around in the solvent that makes up the colloid, okay? So T thyrocytes make thyroid hormone, C thyrocytes make calcitonin. The thyroid hormones that are produced by the T thyrocytes are called thyroxine and triiodothyronine. Triiodothyronine. Thryronine. Is that right? Triiodothyronine. I think it's thyronine without an R there. Anyway, tri as in 3. Okay. I don't know why thyroxine is called 4. I believe it's because it is able to attach 4 iodide molecules, and triiodothyronine can only hold 3 iodide molecules. Iodine, as we know, is an important nutrient. We all eat iodinized salt, right? Back in the day when we didn't have iodinized salt and iodine was in short supply, for certain populations, you end up with thyroid problems. Iodine deficiency can be diagnosed by the presence of what is called a goiter. So your thyroid gland actually swells up because the colloid inside of the follicles, it can't be made into thyroxine or triiodothyronine if there is no iodo part, right? So it's thyroglobulin waiting to be combined with iodine. And if there's no iodine, then the colloid inside of these follicles is just going to build up and build up and build up. And the goiter is literally just all of those colloid-filled follicles expanding with fluid, with colloid. So that's what a goiter is. Your thyroxine and triiodothyronine hormones, just remember that these are thyroid hormones. Okay. You don't really need to know exactly what they do. If there is a pathway, I'll let you know that is specific to T3 or T4 that you need to know, fine. But unless I say so, don't worry about the difference between T4 and T3. They are the 2 thyroid hormones. Calcitonin, again, is another hormone that we're not really sure what it does. Somehow related to bone density. Okay, but it's produced by your C thyrocytes, right? As opposed to, which are kind of out here, away from the follicles or in between the follicles, as opposed to the T thyrocytes, which are producing your thyroxine and triiodothyronine. Okay. So this is a little chart that basically tells you a few of the pathways between your thyroid and the different things, different body systems and how they interact and what they do. Okay, so what thyroid hormone does. So there aren't any of these that I want you to memorize. This is more of a for your information in case you find this very, very interesting. But you don't need to memorize this. This is just fun facts. Okay. Okay. So like I said, the parathyroid glands are these 4 tiny glands that are kind of embedded in the backside of your thyroid gland. Okay, so the thyroid is attached to the front of your trachea and around back, right? This is the back. This is the back of the trachea. You have, of course, your pharynx, which is basically your throat, the back of your throat here. This turns into your esophagus. The thyroid gland wraps around the front of the trachea here, and on the back, you have these 4 little nodules here, which are your parathyroid glands. They're about the size of a pea, little tiny guys. Your parathyroid glands have this appearance under the microscope. I believe we have parathyroid gland slides, specimens for you to look at under the microscope on Thursday. But the parathyroid cells, they are going to, of course, produce parathyroid hormone, which is nice and convenient, right? So your thyroid cells produce, your T thyrocytes produce thyroid hormone, and your parathyroid cells produce parathyroid hormone. Okay, so check this out. This is thyroid all around here on the outside. On the middle here, you have your parathyroid gland, okay? So we're looking at one little parathyroid gland embedded in thyroid tissue around it, right? So you've got your little thyroid follicles full of colloid, just as we would expect. But your parathyroid is basically two different types of cells. You have your parathyroid cells, which are producing your parathyroid hormone, and your oxyphil cells, which are going to be producing other hormones. Yeah, you'll be looking at, I don't know if you'll get to see something quite as nice as this, but hopefully we'll have to take a look and see what kinds of slides you get on Thursday. All right, so your parathyroid glands, consider, okay, so consider low blood calcium. Okay, so your calcium level in your blood is too low. You haven't been drinking your milk or taking your calcium supplements, right? That that actual signal, what causes the parathyroid glands to activate and produce parathyroid hormone, we would call that a humor humoral stimulus, right? That would be a humoral stimulus because it's responding to a chemical change in the surrounding extracellular fluid or humor, right? So the parathyroid glands produce parathyroid hormone, which causes the osteoclasts in your bone to be activated and break down bone tissue to release calcium back into the blood. Calcium reabsorption in the kidney tubule. So basically your kidneys are filtering everything out of your blood, including possibly calcium, which gets taken back up before you actually excrete it into your urine. So reabsorption of calcium out of the urine occurs as a result of parathyroid hormone. And your kidneys are also activated to produce more vitamin D, which helps in calcium absorption, right? Which is why milk is often spiked with vitamin D, right? They often supplement vitamin D in milk. You also are going to increase calcium absorption from your food that's in your small intestines, which all result together in an increase in calcium in the blood. Once that calcium level reaches homeostasis, you have a negative feedback loop causing the parathyroid glands to stop releasing parathyroid hormone, right? Okay, moving down, we're gonna skip the thymus, right? Because we don't really have a thymus, a really active thymus as adults. But your textbook does talk about it briefly in case you are interested. Later on in the chapter, so it's not where you would expect it to be in our little like superior to inferior situation, but there's a little bit on page 635 if you're interested, okay? But we're gonna move on to your adrenal glands, which are these little triangular shaped endocrine glands sitting on top of your kidneys, okay? So you have two adrenal glands. They are so named because they produce adrenaline, right? Which is also known as norepinephrine, closely related to epinephrine, right? So when you think adrenaline, you think adrenal, think adrenaline, but we're calling it norepinephrine, okay? And that is really what your adrenal glands produce, even though we call it adrenaline in casual conversation. In anatomy and physiology, we would call it norepinephrine, okay? So your adrenal glands are attached to the superior aspects of your kidneys. Each adrenal gland, if you were to cut into it, you're going to see, and I thought maybe we had a cross section here. Oh, right here. Check out this cross section of the adrenal gland here. You've got two different layers happening. You've got this pink, like kind of columnar layer on the outside, and then you've got this purple layer on the inside. Those two layers are actually very important. The inner layer is known as the medulla, and it is, if you were to zoom in, sorry, the inner layer is the medulla, which if you were to zoom in looks a little bit like this. And the outer layer, this kind of like columnar looking stuff, we call that the cortex. So this should be fairly easy to remember, right? The cerebral cortex is the outer part of the brain. The medullary cavity is the hollow place inside of your long bones, right? So the medulla is the inside, the cortex is the outside. So you have a couple of different regions here that are important for the production of norepinephrine, okay, along with other important hormones. So when activated either by a neurological stimulus or a hormonal stimulus, you're going to have one of the three zones of your adrenal glands be activated to produce their hormone or produce their effect, whatever that might be, okay? So you might say that each of these zones are gonna have their own receptors, right? Because they're gonna have different responses to potentially the same hormone being received or the same signal being received from probably the brain, okay? Most likely the brain, possibly the thyroid, okay? Because we know the thyroid is involved in metabolism and stuff, right? So your adrenaline, the norepinephrine, that sympathetic nervous system portion of your autonomic nervous system, all of these things are linked, right? Okay, so the zona glomerulosa, this zone is going to be part of the cortex. Okay, it's going to be the most superficial part of the cortex, so closest to the outside of the adrenal gland. The zona glomerulosa is going to make mineralocorticoids. You don't need to know that. Okay, that's it does its own thing. It regulates water and minerals. Okay, so the zona fasciculata or fasciculata, that is going to be the cortex as we see in most images like this. It's like really kind of like pillar looking, liney part of the cortex that we associate with cortex more so. That is going to be creating glucocorticoids, which are involved in your metabolism, right? So we probably are getting a hormonal stimulus at least sometimes from the thyroid gland in order to activate metabolic hormones, right, in the zona fasciculata, which is part of the cortex. Finally, the zona reticularis is part of, is actually right here in between the cortex and the medulla, and it is involved in releasing androgens, okay? So we're going to be releasing certain sex hormones, adrenal sex hormones, adrenal as in coming from the adrenal glands, including androgens, okay, which have a whole suite of effects, which you will learn about in your Labster lab, actually, in part. Here's a little bit more detail about those mineralocorticoids versus glucocorticoids. They're going to increase sodium blood levels. Glucocorticoids produce gluconeogenesis, so basically building glucose, hyperglycemia, too much glucose, mobilizing fats. Again, this is not critical that you know these details. This is more fun facts in case you are curious about this stuff. So these different corticoids, if you hear corticoid, cortisol, these are all either steroid related, which is all hormone related, right? Or just hormone related. The medulla, catecholamines, which is your epinephrine and norepinephrine. So the medulla proper is where you're going to get your norepinephrine, which is your adrenaline. Okay. make it pretty. Okie dokie. And this is what it would look like on a slide. So you hopefully will have a little cross section of the adrenal gland. Just look to see if you can visualize the, well, the capsule is going to be just some epithelial tissue to cover it, connective tissue probably to cover it. The different zones are not nearly as important as just recognizing the cortex on the outside and the medulla on the inside. Okay, cortex on the outside, medulla on the inside. Okay, the medulla being where you get your norepinephrine. But the adrenal glands are involved in metabolism and like water retention, your hydration. Okay. Those are all cortex stuff. All right. Okay. Here's another pretty cross section where you can clearly see the cortex versus the medulla. The medulla part being on the inside is actually directly innervated from the nervous system. Okay, so it's under nervous control. The brain talks directly to the medulla, which means that the production or release of norepinephrine is signaled very quickly, which is, again, if you think about the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system specifically, it is very, very important that when you are in immediate bodily danger, that you are able to react very fast to that to survive, right? You want to get out of there. So the medulla, which is where norepinephrine is released from, needs to be triggered more quickly than can be accomplished by the release of like another hormone up farther up the chain of command, right? So we're going directly from the autonomic part of the central nervous system to the medulla, that is the effector. The medulla is what is producing your norepinephrine, which is going to activate a whole lot of other changes in your body. Your sympathetic nervous system is being activated to initiate basically fight or flight, okay? So it's a short-term stress responses are what the medulla is really in charge of, right? Okay. Okay, continuing down, continuing inferiorly, okay? The pancreas, this is that strange slug-shaped organ that kind of sits underneath your stomach. It is an endocrine gland, so it is endocrine tissue. It has various other parts that this image will help you to identify before you take a look at a slide of the pancreas, which looks like this, which is a little bit more difficult to differentiate the different structures here, okay? So the pancreas is kind of a weird endocrine gland because it does have some exocrine capabilities. So it does have ducts that secrete things into the hollow center of your hollow organs. Okay, so it does secrete things into the lumen of hollow organs via these pancreatic acini, which are literally just little exocrine. They are exocrine cells within this endocrine gland. So sorry, nothing's cut and dry in anatomy and physiology, right? Okay, your don't worry about the islets of Langerhans, except that you may want to try to identify them in a slide, but I'm not going to actually ask you to identify this stuff, okay, on a test question. Don't worry about that. If anything, I would ask you to identify that this is a pancreatic tissue right here. You might be able to tell, or you would be able to tell based on the simple cuboidal stuff surrounding this capsule, okay? So this large capsule, it looks like it's full of tubes that will be within or embedded amongst these what look like little exocrine ducts, okay, all around it. All right, so we are producing glucagon, which is going to be a hormone that helps to trigger insulin production. Somatostatin is also involved in metabolism, pancreatic polypeptide, all metabolism related. Okay, so this is all food or glucose metabolism stuff. Okay, that's what your pancreas is really in charge of. So don't worry about so much how to be able to differentiate between alpha and beta glucagon producing or insulin producing cells. Don't worry about that. This is more just kind of like FYI, if you're interested in identifying the cells on the slide on Thursday. Okay. Yeah, you don't have to differentiate between them visually. Okay. Just know that your glucagon produced by alpha, somatostatin, which is your insulin precursor, produced by beta cells. That's not a heart, that's a B for beta. Well, it looks even more like a heart now. Oh well. Yeah, okay. What happens, those hormones, after they're produced from the pancreas and secreted into the bloodstream by the pancreas, that insulin is going to find its way, as it's in the bloodstream, that blood is going to pass through the liver. The insulin is a hormone, it's a molecule, right? So it is going to attach to receptors in the cells of the liver. The liver then is going to, those cells are going to kind of change their behavior based on the receptors receiving insulin to be more sensitive to, or actually to produce more enzymes that convert glucose into glycogen. Okay, so you have certain proteins that are enzymes that facilitate the chemical reaction that converts glucose into glycogen. Those enzymes will be produced in greater numbers as a result of the stimulation provided by insulin received through the bloodstream. Okay, so we're going to convert glucose into glycogen in the liver. All cells of the body will uptake glucose. The blood glucose level will go from being too high to being back in balance. The pancreas will then produce glucagon if it actually overtips. So if blood glucose goes too low, the pancreas will instead produce glucagon, which will cause the liver to do the opposite thing, okay? So the insulin produced by the insulin produced by the beta cells is going to cause the liver to change glucose into glycogen, while the glucagon produced by the alpha cells is going to cause the liver to convert glycogen back into glucose. Okay, so this is how we maintain that homeostasis, that blood glucose level. And diabetics obviously have trouble with this system, right? They're unable to remove excess blood glucose because they are unable to produce insulin, or because the receptors in other body tissues like the liver don't exist or don't function, and therefore the insulin that is produced by the pancreas doesn't actually do anything because the receptors aren't there, right? So those are kind of the two different types of diabetes, really, right? You've got diabetes where you have no insulin. It's not produced by the pancreas as it should be. And then you have the type of diabetes that is caused by broken or absent receptors for insulin. Two different problems, right? But they result in the same thing. You are unable to remove glucose from the blood. And high blood glucose levels can be very, very dangerous if not corrected, right? And conversely, if you're unable to bring your blood glucose levels back up by converting glycogen back into glucose, via the glucagon signal, that too is very dangerous, right? So this system of homeostasis, of which the pancreas is a key player, is very, very important, right? Okay, your pineal gland. This guy snuck in at the end, mostly because it was snuck in at the end of your textbook. Your pineal gland is, it only gets like one paragraph in here, which made me sad because I like the pineal gland. I think it's really interesting. And now, of course, I don't see it. Huh. Maybe it doesn't even get a paragraph. That's just silly. Anyway, your pineal gland is a little pine cone shaped ball of cells that hangs suspended in the third ventricle, right? So it's like hanging there, bathed in the cerebrospinal fluid that fills that ventricle, that fills all your ventricles, right? So it hangs from the roof of the ventricle. You have two different things going on here. This is actually from Dr. Lee's histology in that pineal gland slide, which is pretty cool. Zoomed in pretty well. You see mostly, it's basically just like homogeneous pineal gland cells. Okay, so these guys are all the cells called pinealocytes. So these are sites, these are cells of the pineal gland, and their job is to produce melatonin. And melatonin is the sleep hormone, right? So your pineal gland is not very well understood, but we know that it receives signals from the primary visual cortex of the occipital lobe, right? It's going to receive signals from the parts of your basal nuclei and like hypothalamus that are involved in light sensing and like time sensing, right? So it kind of sets up, or it detects, and it detects light and other stimuli that allows it to kind of create your circadian rhythm, okay? So it tells you when it's time to be awake and when it's time to be asleep. And when it's time to be asleep, your pineal gland starts making melatonin. So all of these cells start to produce melatonin. A weird thing that happens in the pineal gland, this is a blood vessel, I believe, by the way, in case you're wondering. These are like calcite deposits. It's calcifications. We don't know why this happens. Some people don't get calcifications in their pineal gland until well into until like middle age. But some people have calcifications in their teen years, and it doesn't seem to have any correlation to any like brain diseases or any sleep disorders or anything like that. It's just something that we don't quite understand yet, which of course means that I am like super fascinated by it. It's very interesting. Okay. All right, other endocrine functions. I already kind of touched on this earlier, but your fat, your adipose tissue, it's involved in storing lipid-soluble hormones, of course, right? But it also produces hormones itself, which allow it to create more fat, okay? So basically the creation of adipose tissue is helped along by the present adipose tissue, which is kind of bizarre. Your GI tract, your gastrointestinal tract, right? Gastro as in stomach, intestinal as in intestines. They also produce hormones that are going to regulate the function of your digestive system. Your heart produces hormones that regulate the electrochemical signal that is basically your heartbeat, okay? So the frequency of your ticker, the little electrical guy that triggers your systolic and diastolic heartbeats, which I don't know why I can't think of the name of right now. Wow, can't think of it. So these hormones help to regulate your heart rate by controlling that. And your kidneys, besides your adrenal glands, your kidneys proper are going to produce hormones that help in the production of red blood cells. And again, in hydration. So lots of hormones involved in the filtration process, between the process that actually filters the blood into like pre-urine. And then there's a lot of hormones involved in, oh, well, should we be like actually taking more salt out, or should we be taking more calcium out, or should we be pulling the water out and keeping it versus throw more of that in there. We've got too much of it. Let it go with the urine kind of situation. So all very, very, very complex, all intricately tied with other body systems. Pacemaker, sorry. Hormones involved with your pacemaker produced by your heart. Your endocrine system is closely linked with other systems, intricately linked, very complex. What I talked about in this lecture is basically what you're going to need to know. The slides that you're going to look at on Thursday, ideally, it would be great if you could find a way to differentiate between really just the different endocrine glands. So you don't really necessarily need to know or be able to differentiate the different types of cells within the glands. Maybe the thyroid stuff. Let's go back there real quick and see. Sorry, this lecture is super casual. I'm just feeling it. What can I say? So remember the thyroid gland, you've got the follicle in the middle full of colloid, surrounded by follicular cells, which are really just simple cuboidal epithelium, right? So be able to identify this as being thyroid tissue. I'd like for you to be able to identify this as colloid in here, thyroid, inside the thyroid follicle, follicular cells. That would be nice. Not super worried about T thyrocytes versus C thyrocytes. The thyroid produces thyroid hormone and calcitonin. So if you were to see a picture of a piece of tissue, kind of like what we're going to look at on Thursday, ideally I would like for you to know what gland that comes from. If it's the thyroid gland, be able to tell me about the colloid in the middle of the follicle. That would be nice. What type of gland it is, what hormones it produces, therefore, where it's found in the body, the location in the body. Maybe some general function stuff. Okay, so like the thyroid gland is involved in metabolism. Well, of course. Well, of course it's not going to let me do that. What were you thinking? Is what it's asking me. Right? The parathyroid are also going to be metabolism. Calcium metabolism. Your adrenal glands, fight or flight, right? Also hydration and sex hormones. And the reason why I'm not going into great detail about the ovaries and testes, we're going to talk about them in the reproductive system kind of exclusively. The stuff that I talked about today, there really isn't anywhere else to put it, save maybe the pancreas. But we'll probably not talk about that in too much depth when we get to the digestive system, but the ovaries and the testes we will talk about a lot. In the reproductive system, obviously, that's basically what they are. So we're gonna, you know, save them for there and try and give a little bit more spotlight to the endocrine system here. But yeah, your testes and ovaries also produce sex hormones, of course. And food and glucose metabolism for your pancreas, right? Remember that the hypothalamus is the start of all of this, right? It talks to the anterior pituitary, which is also known as the adenohypophysis, and it talks to the posterior pituitary, which is the neurohypophysis, as well as talking directly to glands like the adrenal glands. The pituitary gland, again, has an anterior and a posterior portion. The anterior portion produces your regulatory hormones, a lot of different regulatory hormones. It's also known as the master gland because of all the regulatory hormones that it produces. Thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Notice that these guys, especially thyroid stimulating, it's probably going to go to the thyroid and stimulate it, right? Adrenocorticotropic, probably going to the adrenal glands. Follicle stimulating, luteinizing, and prolactin. These guys are going to go to either ovaries for follicle stimulating, ovaries and uterus, prolactin, also I think sex hormone related. But anyway, lots and lots of hormones produced by the adenohypophysis, the anterior pituitary, while the posterior pituitary or the neurohypophysis creates and secretes your antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Okay. Okay, so this has to do with, again, hydration. Sorry, that is, that's ugly. Oxytocin. The bonding hormone. And then, of course, all of these guys. So these are all just, oh man, a lot of regulatory hormones. They do a lot of stuff, too much to name. Too much to name. Remember that it is the master gland. I think growth hormone is going to be really the critical one here, okay? But this adenohypophysis, as you can see, sends a lot of hormones out, which means that it is involved in a lot of different body structures, including pretty much every other part of the endocrine system itself, okay? The master gland, the anterior part of the pituitary gland. Okay, you guys? With that, I think I'm going to call it. Make sure again that you go through your week 6 to-do list, do all your stuff. Better to do it now, right? And be able to like kind of sleep on that information and let it go to your long-term memory bank rather than try and cram it before the exams in week 8, right? So we got a couple weeks before week 8. Next week, I'll get you a study guide. But until then, endocrine and autonomic, right? And I will see you guys on Thursday. Bye.